Hello. Let me welcome you at this time to session 21, where we will begin to explore ways that you can attain spiritual growth and understanding. This is number 21, as I said, in a series of videos designed to help you look at life from a more spiritual perspective or a more spiritual point of view. Let us begin. It has already been pointed out that there are many paths to the top of the mountain. The various approaches to religion, the arts, the various disciplines of study that we talked about, and other sources, some of which we have talked about, are all helpful to one degree or another to those seeking to grow and develop themselves spiritually, to increase their spiritual understanding. The three particular disciplines of study that were just mentioned, alchemy, the Kabbalah, and the Tarot, may be of special interest to certain persons who, through previous preparation, either in this life or in previous incarnations, will feel drawn to study in one or more of those areas. This implies that in this life or a previous one they have been prepared to one degree or another for those studies. Other persons, however, who may have only recently become aware of the fact that they are seekers on the path, and whose previous preparation may not have been as extensive, need to know what they can personally do to begin the process of moving forward on that path. Perhaps we can offer assistance for those who find that these videos seem to strike a resonant chord within themselves, or the information certainly within the videos. There are a number of reliable and helpful sources of information for such persons, and it's hoped that these videos will themselves provide more than some small amount of assistance. There are a couple of book lists that you can consider, and one of which we will talk about in this session. You may be aware that there are countless books on the subject of esoteric things, but one should be very careful when selecting what is to be read, especially if one is somewhat of a newcomer or a neophyte in the area of such studies. There's so much out there that is not worthwhile, and you have to be very careful. Read judiciously. There are a great many books available that have been written from an esoteric point of view. Most of them, of course, purport to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. How then does the reader choose? Perhaps some of the suggestions mentioned here will be helpful. Let us begin by suggesting that unless you are receiving confirming guidance from within or from another higher, positive, unseen source that you know is dependable, you probably should not be reading every single book that's recommended to you by others, even if they're well-meaning friends. If you are receiving such guidance as described above, that you know is reliable, then feel free to depend on that guidance to advise you in your day-to-day decisions, including which books you should read and which you should not. If, however, you are receiving guidance and you are not as certain that it is completely reliable, then please be careful. This speaker does not recommend channeling, as it has come to be called, as a reliable means of receiving guidance. First of all, because it intends to encourage seekers to depend on sources that are outside themselves and their own higher selves, or even outside those two other unseen guides or guardians, one of which you have at either shoulder. The motives of these other outside entities, the sources for which some act as channelers, may or may not be all that they seem. Instead, the seeker should ideally go within to the higher self, from whom initial unseen spiritual guidance will normally come. This guidance is sometimes called our intuition, sometimes called our conscience, and sometimes called even our still, small voice within. You can and should encourage and develop a rapport with that positive inner source of guidance, the higher self. There's information on how to do so under the headings that follow later. The information mentioned is concerning meditation and consciousness, and is under the headings Meditation and also the heading Consciousness and Communication with Your Higher Self. Developing this kind of communication is not an overnight task, and it could take years. Once it's been accomplished, however, then you should allow the logical progression of spiritual development to continue from that point onward. When you receive from your higher self, what you receive, from your higher self may be sufficient for your needs in this incarnation. For a great many people, it is more than enough. For some, however, there may also be contact from one or both of the two other guides or guardians that were mentioned previously, one at each shoulder. Let it be said once again, however, since it is so important, that such spiritual development should not be expected overnight. It is, in fact, almost always a slow, steady progression that allows the lines of communication to be opened very gradually over a period of years, or even over one's lifetime or longer. Even then, it will usually take place only if one has shown the desire, the dedication, the commitment, and the proper attitude in one's heart that are all necessary in order for someone to be given such a rare blessing. If you don't find such a blessing in your own life, don't be overly concerned. It may not be time for you. These things happen when they are ready. When you feel drawn to these things, when they strike a resonant chord within your being, then that's a time perhaps to start looking further. If you feel uncertain about the reliability of information that you have received from unseen higher sources, you can and should feel free to ask the source of any such information. Are you attuned to and do you serve the positive aspects of the greater light? Or, better still, ask that entity, do you come in the Christ Spirit? The response to one of, if not both of these questions must always be yes. If it is not, you may be dealing with the lower self or another entity that may not have your best interest at heart. More will be said later about the lower self under the heading Consciousness and Communication with Your Higher Self. Depending on the situation, you may even be dealing, as indicated, with some other negative entity, as I said, who does not have your best interest at heart. In either case, you may ask the questions as stated above. If your beliefs are not Christian, do not be concerned. The Christ Spirit is universal, and the use of its name in such a question will not offend any if your motives are proper. It may even prevent a great deal of grief by assuring that the information you receive is reliable. If you still feel uncomfortable, however, about asking the question of whether it comes in the Christ Spirit, then by all means do instead that with which you feel most safe and comfortable. Excuse me. It will be helpful to say at this time that all the books mentioned here are very worthwhile reading. These lists will be especially beneficial for those who are not yet receiving guidance from higher unseen positive sources. Note also that those books included on the first list here should be interesting and worthwhile reading for any person, regardless of the level of mystical and spiritual development they may have attained. Beginning with that wonderful story, The Pilgrim's Progress, however, by John Bunyan, which we've already discussed, at that point in the list, the reading may become somewhat more difficult. But if so, it's still worth the effort required. It's not recommended that you try to read any of these works at one sitting. In fact, the opposite is so. On the contrary, read for a while, and when you reach a reasonable break point, put the book down and resume reading at a later time or date. This will give your inner consciousness adequate time to properly assimilate that which has been read. Let me say that there is no intention here to imply in any way that these lists contain the only worthwhile books for the sincere seeker. There are many others, not the least of which are those that are used by the various religions and theological beliefs of the world, presuming that they teach, of course, that which is attuned to the higher positive forces. Those teachings that were mentioned, of course, include, but are not limited to, the Old and New Testaments of the Judeo-Christian Bible, the teachings of Buddha, the I Ching, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Quran, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and others. The study of any one or more of these teachings, if done judiciously, could be of significant additional benefit to the seeker. Getting back to the subject at hand, however, the following list constitutes the first group of books recommended here for the benefit of the sincere seeker. And we will talk now about the books on book list 1. The first is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Life After Life by Raymond Moody. There is a River by Thomas Segru. It's the story of Edgar Cayce. The Alchemist of the Rocky Mountains by Frater Albertus. The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. The Aeneid of Virgil by Virgil. Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained by John Milton. The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach. The film is very, very special, and I recommend it highly. I want to thank you for watching. In session 22, the next session, we'll look at the second book list, and we'll also begin a discussion on meditation. Again, thank you very much for watching.